So the three things today: Herod, the Magi, and we're going to look at two completely different ways of approaching God, and then the gifts. So Herod, the Magi, and the gifts. So today the church celebrates the Epiphany, and we've probably all said it before, I had an epiphany, right? The word literally means a manifestation, a revelation, an unveiling. And in this context in the church, it's an unveiling of who Jesus is, that he is, yes, the Messiah and the Son of God, the Savior of the world. And we'll see tomorrow, we celebrate the baptism of the Lord, and throughout the week, we'll hear different epiphanies, different revelations that Jesus is God. The church is trying to drive home to us that this is real, and he's the one you want to follow. I was struck yesterday after the 4:30 Mass. I was speaking to a young couple, they're in their 30s, and I hadn't seen him before, and he said, I've tried everything. I've tried all the things that this world has to offer, and because I asked him, what brought you here today? And he said, I realized that the missing piece in my life was God. And the young lady said, I always say that in the equation, when we try to take God out of the one who created us, it's going to fall apart. And I thought, there's wisdom there, right? The one who created us with order in our lives, if we take him out, we're going to find chaos, which is exactly what the enemy wants. So with that in mind, let's look at these three things. First, let's look at Herod. So Herod was, they say, probably half Jewish. He was from the line of Esau, and so he was part Jewish and part Gentile, but he was placed in Judea by the Romans to kind of keep them in line. But he was not royalty. He was not from the line of King David. And so he was kind of an illegitimate king, if you will. And he was always looking over his shoulder, always looking for who is my next enemy, who's the next threat to my power. And of course, when he starts to hear about this newborn king, his antennas go up and think, he makes it sound like, bring me word so I can go worship him too. Obviously, it's a front. He just wants to go kill the threat. And about 10 days ago, we celebrated the Holy Innocents, all of those young boys, 2 years old and younger, that he killed, trying to wipe out the threat. And think about that in our own lives. If we bring this to 2023, are there ways that we act like King Herod, in a sense where we see everyone as a threat to my power, my authority, my wealth? It's a very interesting way of living, and you're always on edge, right? You're always thinking, okay, who's coming after me now? I remember at one of our baseball retreats in California that we do at the end of each season, this young guy that played for the Phillies, he said, Father, he grew up Catholic and very faith-filled. He said, what I hate about what I become is, he said, I see everyone as coming after my money. And that's how he said, I've started to look at people as a threat, or young ladies, he says, I don't know if they're coming for me or if they're just coming for what I have. And he said, I hate that about what I've become. Interesting. The second point are the Magi. This is a Greek word that literally means wise men. And I'll talk about how we get kings out of this in a little bit. So who are the wise men? It says they came from the east. We're not sure exactly where, but they were pagans. They were probably what we would call a combination of a philosopher, an astrologer, and astronomers. They were looking at the stars, and not only did the Jews believe that a Messiah was coming, but many of the pagans did also. They were looking for, because there were a lot of prophecies, some of which that are in our first readings, that were pointing to this newborn king of the Jews. And so they kept looking and they kept waiting. And when they saw this star, they came. And so it's interesting, even though they were considered outsiders, they weren't Jewish, but they came running when they saw this star. Where did they come? They first came to Jerusalem. And there were prophecies that were talking about that this newborn king would come in Jerusalem. And so when they get to Jerusalem, who do they go to, of course, but the king. And they tell him about the star. They tell King Herod that there's the newborn king of the Jews. And, he starts to say, go find him and then come back and bring me word so that I too can do him homage. What's interesting about these wise men is that even though they weren't Jewish, they were coming to worship this king. I find that fascinating. We've heard the story and we're very familiar with the story, but think about it, it would be like us going to Belgium because we heard that they had some new king that was born. It really doesn't make sense in our mentality, but there was something powerful about this king. And as you read the church fathers, if you try to follow a star at night, it's not going to lead you anywhere. The star's just up there. But this star was leading them to Bethlehem, leading them to this place where Jesus was born. And many of the church fathers will say that this star was probably an angel. This angel was leading them to this place on purpose. And if we look at prophecies, this is what convinces me. There's many things that convince me that all of this is true. If we look at how many of the prophecies of the Old Testament are filled in the New Testament. If we go back to Isaiah, the first reading, he talks about nations will walk by your light and kings by your shining radiance. So there's an image of light, a star, and kings will come. And this is where the wise men have become kings. Were they kings? We don't know, but the prophecies are talking about kings coming from all the nations to this Messiah. It goes on to say, the wealth of nations shall be brought to you, these gifts. Caravans of camels shall fill you. And see, we have a camel over there. I always wondered, why do they have camels in Bethlehem? But it's this image of these kings coming from the east, bringing their gifts. Dromedaries from Midian and Ephah, all from Sheba, so all these places around the world shall come, bearing what? Gold and frankincense. They don't talk about myrrh here, and we'll talk about that, but they were bringing gold and frankincense. We'll get to the gifts in a minute. We go to Psalm 72 that we sang this morning. It says, the kings of Tarshish and the isles, again, these places in the east, shall offer their gifts. The kings of Arabia and Seba shall bring tribute. All kings shall pay him homage. All nations shall serve him. So one of the themes of the Epiphany is that this Messiah did not just come for the Jews, but he came for all the nations. And the goal, eventually, of the Jewish dream was that all the Gentiles would come to Jerusalem and would convert. And what we're going to find is they do that. And most of us, maybe there's some of us that have Jewish ancestry, but most of us are Gentiles. Most of us have come from, the East and the West, and yet we are here today in 2023 in Hinsdale, Illinois, worshiping the same King that's been worshiped for 2,000 years all over the world. Is this just a story that's been made up? I don't think so. 1.2 billion Catholics in the world today. Think of all the billions that have gone before us the last 2,000 years. We all have come to worship the same King. And so it brings us to the gifts. These magi, once they found the Lord, it says they prostrated themselves. They hit the floor because they came to worship the King. It brings me back to my own ordination. If you've ever been to an ordination, one of the things we do is we literally prostrate ourselves face down on the floor, nose to the marble, and it's this sense of, I realize this isn't about me. I'm laying down my life for this God who loves me, and I want the world to know about him. That's why when we come into a Catholic church, we look for this light, kind of like the Star of Bethlehem. What does that light tell us? That Jesus is here in the tabernacle, and we genuflect. We go to our knee as a sign, I am not God, but he is. And so I always want to encourage you, because some churches may not have the tabernacle in the center of the church. Look for that light, because it's showing you where Jesus is. Sometimes we come and we just kind of genuflect, not even knowing why we're doing what we're doing, but it's come to worship. We're coming together to worship the King. And then what gifts do they offer him? But gold, frankincense, and now myrrh. So gold, what does that stand for? It's fit for a king. And we know that Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Frankincense, we use incense for God. We still do that to this day, where we'll incense the altar as a sign of our prayers rising to God. And then myrrh is something that was added from the prophecy. Myrrh was used to anoint bodies for burial. And so what these kings, maybe unknowingly what they're doing is they're showing us that this newborn baby was born to die, that he came to offer his life as a ransom for the world. And so they offered him their very best gifts. And when you encounter the living God, instead of approaching the world like King Herod, where this is mine, everything is mine, and everyone and everything is a threat to my kingdom, these kings came and they encountered the King of the universe, and they opened their arms and they offered him their very best. This is what happens when we encounter the living God. When we have a personal encounter with this God who loves us more than we can possibly imagine, we realize that life is not about us anymore, but life is about worshiping him. Life is about returning to him all the blessings and gifts that he's already given us. And so let us reflect on these three things this week. Do I approach the world? Do I approach others like King Herod? Do I approach God and everyone else like the Magi, realizing that he is the King, that I come to prostrate myself to worship the King of Kings, that I come to offer him my very best gifts? God has given us the gift of time, the gift of talent, and the gift of treasure. It's all a gift. I believe it was St. Catherine of Siena. She says, all is gift. And it truly is. Everything good that we have is a gift from God. How do we respond to that? Let us respond like the three Magi, these kings, and say, Lord, everything that I have is yours.